The water of the Rhine doesn't just flow, it swallows secrets. My name is Alaric Beaumont. As a retired marine engineer, I've spent my life studying the integrity of massive structures, but I failed to notice the rot inside my own home.
It was a foggy October morning in Cologne when I met my son-in-law, Viktor Volkov, by the river. He smiled, but it was a structural lie, a veneer that didn't reach his predatory eyes. Then came the shove. It wasn't just gravity, it was the ultimate betrayal. The iron railing snapped like a dry twig because it had been sabotaged. Victor had used acid to corrode the bolts, calculating the exact moment they would fail under my weight. As the freezing current filled my lungs and pulled me into the dark, I looked up. Victor wasn't reaching for his phone to save me. He was checking his watch, waiting for the river to finish his work. He didn't just want me dead, he wanted my €5.2 million legacy. If you've ever felt a chill down your spine about the people sitting at your own dinner table, you need to hear how I survived this nightmare. Before we dive into the blueprints of this cold liquidation, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. If you're ready to see how a grandfather and his grandson took down a monster, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. You won't believe what was hidden behind the ventilation grates of my own bedroom. The Rhine doesn't forgive mistakes. In October, the river in Cologne turns a bruised shade of grey, the kind of colour that reminds you exactly how deep the water is and how little it cares for the life of a 70-year-old man. I stood on the promenade, the fog so thick I could barely see the twin spires of the cathedral through the haze. As a retired marine engineer, I've spent my life respecting the water and the steel we build to cross it. I understand how things hold together and how they fail. I was leaning against the iron railing, my hand gripping the cold metal, when a shadow fell across my path. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. The expensive scent of his cologne and the rhythmic, rehearsed thud of his high-end sneakers always announced him before his voice did. "You're out early, Alaric," Viktor Volkov said. I turned slightly. My son-in-law was 41, dressed in sleek running gear that cost more than my first car. He looked vibrant, a sharp contrast to the damp gloom of the morning. He smiled. But it was a calculated expression, a thin layer of charm that didn't reach his eyes, eyes that always seemed to be measuring the room for its exit points. "The river is the only thing in this city that stays honest, Victor," I replied, keeping my voice as steady as a heavy-duty piling. "I heard the rumors about your tech startup. The Series B funding isn't coming, is it?" Victor's face hardened. The mask of the dutiful son-in-law slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the cold, predatory calculation beneath. I'd seen that look before, usually on the faces of men who were about to watch a ship sink and were only concerned with the insurance payout. "You should worry less about my finances and more about your health," he said, his voice dropping to a low, feathered concern that made the hair on my neck stand up. "The walk is getting to be too much for a man your age. You look confused." "I've never been sharper," I told him, tightening my grip on the railing. Then came the shove. It wasn't a clumsy push, it was a practiced, efficient transfer of weight. I felt the iron railing give way, not because of age, but because it had been sabotaged. My engineering mind caught the detail even as I began to fall. The bolts had been corroded with acid, eaten away until the structural integrity was a lie. I hit the water with a bone-jarring shock. The Rhine was a liquid tomb. The freezing current filled my lungs like liquid fire, and the weight of my wool coat pulled me down into the dark. I clawed at the surface, but the river was a physical weight, a cold hand pressing me into the silt. Just as the darkness began to close in, a strong hand grabbed the collar of my coat. Marcel Petit, a 28-year-old competitive rower, had been doing his morning training laps. He was a man built of lean muscle and urgency. He hauled me toward the muddy bank, his sleek boat bobbing nearby. "Stay with me," he shouted, his voice commanding. Coughing up the river, my vision was a blurring mess of salt and grey light. Through the haze, I saw Victor's silhouette on the promenade above. He wasn't reaching for his phone to call for help. He was checking his watch, waiting for the water to finish his work. Marcel looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Victor. "I saw him up there," Marcel whispered to me as he pulled me to safety. "I saw him right before you fell." But Victor was already moving. His phone was finally at his ear, his voice carrying across the water with a practiced, frantic panic. "Help! My father-in-law fell. Please, send an ambulance." The performance had begun. The ride to the hospital was a blur of neon lights and the rhythmic thumping of the ambulance floor. Victor sat beside me, holding my hand with a grip that was more about ownership than comfort. He leaned over me, his shadow blocking out the flickering lights. "Save your strength, Alaric," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "You're confused. Just breathe." I tried to speak, to tell the medic about the acid and the shove, but my throat was a raw cavern of river water and blood. The medic misinterpreted my terror for a heart under stress. There is a specific kind of horror in being sane when the world is being convinced, politely and professionally, that your mind is a rotting structure. When we arrived at the clinic, the world became a sea of sterile white and harsh fluorescent lights. Victor stayed behind to talk to the admitting staff, seeding the poison before I even touched a bed. "He's 70, I heard him say through the open door of the trauma bay. "But he's been acting much older lately." I was afraid something like this would happen. He was building a cage out of my own aging body, and the doctors were handing him the keys. The neurologist, a man with the detached curiosity of a circuit board examiner, looked at my chart. Victor's performance was masterful. "He's been forgetting things, doctor. Last week, he thought it was 1990. I think the river was just the breaking point." "That's a lie," I managed to croak, the sedative the nurse had given me, making my tongue feel like a heavy, sodden plank. "I remember the shove. I remember his hands." Victor simply sighed, a sound of profound, mournful patience that made the doctor nod in sympathy. "You see, he's agitated, hallucinating. It's the dementia." I realized then that the sedative wasn't standard procedure. Victor had whispered something to the staff about my violent outbursts, ensuring I would be too drugged to defend myself during the evaluation. My memories were starting to feel like ink running in the rain, lines blurring until the structure I knew was gone. By the time the doctor left, I was drifting in a chemical fog. Victor lingered for a moment, his tailored silhouette framed by the door. "Sleep well, Alaric," he said. I lay there, staring at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, trying to reconstruct the morning with a technician's precision. I had designed ships that resisted hurricanes. How could I be falling apart now? I reached up to adjust the plastic ID band, biting into my wrist when I felt something. A small, crumpled scrap of paper tucked under the edge of the plastic. I pulled it out with trembling fingers, squinting at the messy scrawl. It wasn't from a doctor. It was from Hugo, my 12-year-old grandson. "I saw him leave early," the note read. He didn't have his running shoes on. The note was a thin lifeline in a sea of grey. It confirmed the most terrifying truth of all. Victor hadn't just been out for a run. He had planned the accident and then changed into his expensive gear to play the part of the grieving son-in-law. The hunt hadn't ended at the Rhine. It had just moved indoors. I folded the paper and hid it in the palm of my hand, the rough edge of the truth cutting through the chemical haze. I wasn't being released. I was being transferred to a different kind of custody. The heavy doors of the ward clicked shut, and I knew I had to find a way out before the care Victor had planned became permanent. I wasn't just a grandfather anymore. I was a man trapped in a failing design, and I had exactly one chance to find the loose bolt. Freedom usually comes with a signed discharge paper and a breath of fresh air. But as the orderly locked the brakes on my wheelchair at the hospital exit, I realized I wasn't being released. I was being transferred to a different kind of custody. The antiseptic smell of the clinic clung to my skin like a second layer of sweat, a reminder of the institutional walls that had already failed to protect me from the man standing by the car. I watched my daughter, Elena Volkov, waiting by her luxury SUV. She was a 40-year-old art curator whose life was as carefully curated as the galleries she managed. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and a hidden, flickering shame, her hands smoothing a silk scarf that likely cost more than my first drafting table. "I'm going home, Elena," I said, my voice still a raspy grate from the river water. "I built that house in Cologne with my own hands. I know where the spare keys are, and I know where I belong." "Dad, you almost drowned," she replied, using a tone of forced maternal concern that made my skin crawl. "The doctor says you're not tracking reality. You're coming to stay with us in the Black Forest. It's for your own safety." It was then I saw the corner of a folder in her designer bag, a legal document confirming she had already initiated a temporary emergency guardianship. Filing. They were using my disorientation, a disorientation they had manufactured, as the primary weight to tip the scales against my autonomy. The luxury car door closed with a soft, expensive thud that isolated me from the world. As we exited the city, I watched the familiar streets blur through the stale, recycled air of the climate control. The drive into the Black Forest was a descent into isolation. The trees grew thick and dark, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers over the road. By the time we pulled into the driveway of their secluded villa, the gates clicked shut behind us with a finality that sounded like a prison bolt sliding home. Victor was standing on the porch, his smile never reaching his predatory eyes. He didn't wait for me to get out. He reached in and grabbed my shoulder. His grip wasn't supportive, it was a claim of ownership. "We thought you'd appreciate the privacy up here, Alaric," Victor said, his voice smooth as polished marble as he guided me past the elegant master suites to a converted attic space on the 3rd floor. I looked around the room, my engineer's eye immediately cataloguing the modifications. Privacy, Victor? Or just a clear line of sight for those lenses in the crown molding? I asked, pointing to the discreet high-resolution cameras nestled in the woodwork. He didn't blink. He simply set my bag on a chair that smelled of fresh paint. The chemical tang was sharp, a specific industrial solvent used to strip lead. It hit the back of my throat, a physical trigger meant to incite the very headaches and confusion he wanted the cameras to record. "We value routine in this house, Alaric," he told me, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive espresso on his breath. "It helps keep everyone focused." "Focus on what, Victor?" I shot back, the next quarterly report or the next accident. He didn't answer. He just stepped out and engaged the latch. The clicking sound of the hallway cameras adjusting their focus followed me like a persistent insect. I lay on the bed, and that's when I heard it, a low, persistent hum coming from the ventilation grate. As an engineer, I knew the acoustic properties of a home. This wasn't the HVAC system. It was a white noise generator, a clever structural addition designed to mask the sounds of the family below while they finalized my quiet disappearance. Dinner was a theater of the macabre. Elena brought up a tray of expensive local berries and a steak that was overly salted. I noticed an overly sweet chemical aftertaste clinging to the edges of the fruit, the same irritant from the room's paint. It was a subtle toxin designed to induce the very fogginess they were documenting. "Elena," I said, pushing the plate away, "the debt for your gallery, it's €450,000, isn't it?" She froze, her fork clattering against the porcelain. Her face turned a sickly, translucent pale. How do you know that?" she whispered. "I'm an engineer, Elena. I know when a structure is under immense strain. You're the drywall over the rot. Beautiful, seamless, and completely complicit," I said, my voice shedding its confused veneer. "You're being paranoid," she suddenly screamed, using the very words I would later find in Victor's notes to shield herself from the truth. "You're delusional. I'm calling Victor. You need to be upstairs." She fled the room, but not before her phone slipped from her pocket and skittered across the floor. I leaned over, my eyes narrowing as the screen flickered to life with a text from Victor. "Is the old man quiet? The backers say we need his signature by Friday or the house is gone." They weren't just killing me for profit. They were killing me for survival. I was sent back to my attic tomb. I lay awake, my lungs still feeling heavy as if the river silt had never truly left them. The industrial smell grew thicker in the humid midnight air, making my head throb. I mapped the house's layout in my mind, searching for a flaw in the cage. A faint metallic click sounded at the door, the latch being lifted from the outside. My heart started hammering against my ribs as a small figure slipped into the room, silhouetted by the pale moon. It was Hugo, my 12-year-old grandson. He moved with a ghostly quiet toward my bedside. "Grandpa, don't make a sound," he breathed, his voice so low it was almost lost to the white noise. "He can hear your breathing." "Hugo, what are you doing here?" I asked, reaching out to touch his arm. He was shaking. "You have to see the papers," he insisted. "He thinks you're too far gone to care, but he's cleaning out everything." Hugo led me out of the room, guiding me with a terrifying expertise through the shadows. He knew exactly which floorboards to avoid so as not to trigger the sensors Victor had installed. We descended to the second floor, the heavy rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock downstairs, marking the time like a heartbeat. We stopped before the heavy mahogany door of Victor's office. Hugo produced a key he had swiped from Victor's gym bag and slowly inserted it. The key turned with a heavy sound, the sound of a vault opening or a grave. "He's in here every night," Hugo whispered, his eyes darting to the stairs. "He stays until 1:30 in the morning, Grandpa, every single night. He's doing things to the accounts, dark things." We stepped inside. The office was bathed in the sickly blue light reflecting off 3 massive computer monitors. Stepping into that room felt like walking into a crime scene that hadn't happened yet. On the screens, I saw the true state of Victor's world. The charts weren't climbing, they were bleeding crimson lines of total capital collapse, but it was the physical drawer beneath the desk that caught my eye. One reinforced with steel, I pulled out a leather-bound folder. Inside was a document that turned my blood to ice. Alaric Beaumont. Contingency Phase 2. It was a printed draft of a massive life insurance policy listing Victor Volkov as the sole beneficiary. Below it lay a power of attorney document with my signature perfectly forged. "This isn't my signature," I whispered, the paper crinkling under my white-knuckled grip. Then I saw the names of the previous clients in a secondary file, Margaret and Susan. Both had died in accidents involving water, just as their bank accounts ran dry. I realized then that I wasn't just a victim. I was a line item on a balance sheet. "Grandpa, the light on the door," Hugo hissed, his hand grabbing my shoulder. The red laser of the security sensor on the door frame suddenly blinked green. A heavy, deliberate footstep echoed in the hallway right outside. I shoved Hugo toward the knee-hole of the massive desk, and we scrambled into the narrow space just as the handle turned with a sharp metallic snap. The door swung open. The room was suddenly filled with the heavy, cloying scent of expensive bourbon. Victor entered, the rhythm of his dress shoes sounding like a countdown. He didn't turn on the lights. He walked straight to the desk, his silhouette hovering directly above our heads. "Just a few more days then," I heard him mutter to the empty air, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "Then we can finally balance the books." He tapped a restless beat on the desk, just inches from my head, before turning and leaving as quickly as he had come. As the sound of his footsteps faded, I sat in the darkness, holding my grandson. The structure of my family hadn't just cracked, it had been rigged for a controlled demolition. Victor wasn't just a CEO, he was an actuary of murder, and I was the third-quarter dividend. "Hugo," I whispered into the dark. "Tomorrow at 1:30 a.m., when he's back in this room, we aren't going to be hiding. We're going to be the defect in his design." The silence in the Black Forest house was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a deep-sea trench, the kind that makes your ears pop and your heart labor against the weight of the unknown. I sat in my third-floor attic room, the white noise generator humming its synthetic, rhythmic pulse. To anyone else, it was a soothing background drone. To me, a man who spent 40 years calculating the frequency of engine vibrations, it was a tactical screen. It was designed to drown out the sounds of footsteps, whispers, and the clicking of locks. At precisely 1:15 a.m., the latch on my door moved. It was a faint, metallic sound that most people would have missed, but I had been counting the seconds. Hugo slipped into the room, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight filtering through the pine trees outside. He wasn't wearing pajamas. He was dressed in dark, rugged clothing, and he held a small, black object in his hand, a high-speed USB drive. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "He's in the shower. He takes exactly 12 minutes. We have to move now." We didn't speak again. We moved like shadows through a vessel's hull. Hugo led the way, his young eyes navigating the sensors Victor had installed with a terrifying familiarity. He knew which floorboards groaned and which camera angles had blind spots. We descended to the second floor, the air growing colder as we approached the heavy mahogany door of Victor's private office. Hugo produced a key he had swiped from Victor's gym bag. The lock turned with a sharp, final click that sounded like a gunshot in the dead of night. We slipped inside, and the door closed behind us, sealing us in a room that smelled of expensive bourbon and cold, calculated greed. The office was bathed in the sickly blue light of 3 massive computer monitors. I stood before the desk, my hands trembling as I reached for the physical files. I wasn't looking for sentiment. I was looking for the stress points of a criminal enterprise. I found a leather-bound folder tucked into a steel-reinforced drawer. On the cover, in precise, professional lettering, were the words, "Liquidation Plan, Phase 2. I opened it, and the breath left my lungs. The first page was a life insurance policy. It wasn't just a document, it was a price tag on my life, €5.2 million, payable to Viktor Volkov upon my accidental death. Beneath it lay the power of attorney documents. My eyes traced the signature at the bottom. It was a masterpiece of forgery, my own handwriting, perfectly mimicked, granting Victor total control over my maritime engineering firm and my private accounts. But it was the notary seal that turned my blood to ice. The name stamped in gold foil wasn't a stranger's. It was Stefan Volkov, Victor's own brother. "The whole family is a parasite," I muttered, my voice a raspy grate. "Grandpa, look at this," Hugo whispered, pointing to a secondary ledger. I scanned the numbers. They weren't just bank balances, they were a timeline of theft. Elena's signature was there too, appearing on withdrawal slips totaling nearly €800,000. They hadn't even waited for me to die. They had already started eating my legacy while I was still breathing. "Do you know what it's like, Hugo?" I asked, my voice tight. "To realize your own flesh and blood is measuring you for a coffin while you're sitting at their dinner table." "He doesn't see people, Grandpa," Hugo said, his gaze fixed on the door. "He just sees decimal points." I dug deeper into the drawer, past the financial ruins, and found a hidden compartment. Inside was a small velvet-lined box. It looked like a trophy case. I pulled out a series of news clippings, their edges yellowed and dry. Clara Van Houten, tragic boating accident in the North Sea. Bridget Fisher, private pool drowning in Zurich. Taped to the back of the clippings were surveillance photos of these women. They were wealthy, they were isolated, and both had been married to Victor under different aliases. He wasn't just a failed CEO, he was an actuary of murder. The water wasn't an accident, it was his signature. "He's not just taking my money, Hugo," I whispered, the realization hitting me harder than the river current ever could. "I'm the third building in a skyline of corpses. I'm the next quarterly dividend." Suddenly, the blue light of the monitors flickered. A notification popped up on the center screen. "Security alert. Master bedroom shower deactivated." "He's coming," Hugo hissed. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I grabbed the USB drive and jammed it into the computer tower. The progress bar for the file copy felt like it was moving through molasses. 10%, 30%, 60%. The heavy, deliberate thud of footsteps echoed from the floor above. Victor was moving. "Grandpa, we have to go." 90%, 100%. I ripped the drive out just as the hallway floorboards groaned. We scrambled under the massive mahogany desk, tucking our legs tight against the cold wood. The door handle turned with a sharp metallic snap. Victor entered the room. He didn't turn on the lights. He walked straight to the desk, his silhouette hovering directly above us. I could hear his rhythmic, shallow breathing. He reached for the mouse, the clicking sound amplified in the absolute silence of the office. "Just a few more days, Alaric," I heard him mutter to the empty air. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Then the house is gone, and so are you. We finally balance the books." He tapped a restless beat on the desk, inches from my head. Before turning and leaving, the lock engaged with a finality that left us in total darkness. We waited for 5 minutes before Hugo guided me back out. We couldn't go back to the attic. Victor would be checking. We needed to hide the evidence somewhere he would never look. Somewhere that defied his logical, predatory mind. "The studio," I whispered. We slipped into Elena's private art sanctuary. It was a room filled with oil paints, expensive silk swatches, and the smell of a guilty conscience. I looked at the walls, analyzing the structure. This room had been renovated recently. I saw the exposed Dummthep, the steel load-bearing beam, near the ceiling header. "Hugo, help me up." I climbed onto a stool, my 70-year-old bones protesting every inch of the way. I reached behind the cold, industrial steel of the beam. As an engineer, I knew that Victor would search for digital footprints and paper trails, but he would never think to check the structural integrity of the house itself. He saw the world as a series of spreadsheets. I saw it as a system of forces and supports. I secured the USB drive behind the beam using a magnetic strip I'd found in my drafting kit. It was a tiny piece of plastic the size of my thumbnail, but it carried enough weight to level Victor's empire. "What if he finds it, Grandpa?" Hugo asked as we climbed back down. "He won't," I said, my resolve hardening into something as cold and unyielding as the Rhine. "He thinks I'm a crumbling ruin. He thinks my mind is a rotting structure. But a building only falls if the foundation is weak, Hugo. And mine is still solid." As I looked at the hidden spot, I realized that I had to play the part he wanted. I had to be the victim, the confused old man, the drifting elder. I would let him build his case, brick by lying brick, while I waited for the moment to pull the pin on the grenade I'd just hidden in his walls. "Go to bed, Hugo," I whispered, squeezing his shoulder. "From now on, we play the part. We let him see exactly what he expects to see." I returned to my attic room, the white noise generator still humming its deceptive tune. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, my mind mapping out the next phase of the fight. Viktor Volkov thought he was an expert in liquidation. He thought he could erase me like a bad debt. But he had forgotten one thing. You never know the true strength of a structure until you try to tear it down. The water was calling for me again. I could feel it in my lungs. But this time, I wasn't going to be the one who drowned. I was the one holding the blueprints to the wreck. The studio felt smaller than it had an hour ago, the air thick with the smell of oil paints and the heavy, suffocating weight of the truth. I stood before Elena, no longer the drifting, confused old man she had been trained to see. I held my wife's wedding ring, the one she had taken for safekeeping, and I saw the flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. "You're not his partner, Elena," I said, my voice as cold and steady as a deep-sea current. "In his world, there are no partners. There are only assets to be liquidated and liabilities to be erased. Look at these names. Clara, Brigitte. They weren't strangers. They were women who sat at his table just like you do, and now their names on death certificates." I watched the color drain from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow shell of the woman I had raised. She looked at the laptop screen, at the forged signatures and the insurance policies, and I saw the moment her reality finally snapped. "I thought he said it was just a loan," she whispered, her hands shaking so violently the silk swatches on her desk rattled. "He said the house was in trouble." "I didn't know about the river, Dad, I swear." "The law doesn't care what you knew, Elena. It cares what you signed," I told her, stepping closer. "But right now, your children are in a house with a man who is calculating the cost of their silence. If you want to be a mother again, you have to stop being his accomplice. Right now." The silence that followed was the most honest moment we had shared in years. Then she grabbed her keys. We drove to the Cologne police headquarters in a frantic, silent blur. The city lights outside the SUV window felt like a strobe, freezing the panic on Elena's face in jagged intervals. I clutched the USB drive in my pocket, the tiny piece of plastic feeling like a live grenade. Inspector DuPont met us in a windowless interview room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. I didn't waste time. I laid out the evidence, the dry cleaning receipt with the river silt, the forged power of attorney, and the files recovered from Victor's private server. "I'm a marine engineer, Inspector," I said, my voice echoing in the sterile space. "I spent 40 years learning how things fail under pressure. This isn't just a financial dispute. This is a systematic plan for murder." DuPont, a man with weathered skin and eyes that had seen the worst of the city's secrets, scrolled through the files. His face went grim. "This is more than enough for a warrant, Mr. Beaumont. We're mobilizing a team now." But then, the air in the room changed. One of the tech specialists, a young man with a focused scowl, looked up from his monitor. "Inspector, We have a problem. There's an active GPS uplink coming from a device in this building. It's high frequency, military grade. My heart stopped. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wife's gold wedding ring. I'd felt a slight weight difference earlier, but I'd attributed it to my own nerves. The tech took it with a pair of tweezers and scanned it. There's a micro-tracker embedded behind the setting, he said. He knows exactly where you are. He's known the whole time. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated with a violence that made my hand go numb. The caller ID was a private number. I answered it on speaker. You should have stayed in the attic, Alaric. Victor's voice came through, stripped of all its polished charm. It was the raw, predatory sound of a man whose empire was falling, and he was looking for someone to bury in the wreckage. Where are they, Victor? I demanded, my lungs tightening. I'm at the school, Alaric. Hugo and Sophie were so happy to see me. I told them you'd had a relapse, and we were going for a little trip. We're moving now. If I see a single police car, the plan for your accidental end becomes their reality. The line went dead. Elena let out a sharp, rhythmic sob that tore through the room. He has them. Oh God, he has them. Track his vehicle, DuPont barked, and the room exploded into motion. 15 minutes of pure, agonizing terror followed as the police traced Victor's burner phone and the GPS on his rental car. The signal eventually stopped at a place called Morneo Reset, the Rusty Anchor. It was a crumbling two-story motel on Highway 4, a relic on the edge of the city that was mostly used by people who didn't want to be found. By the time the convoy reached the highway, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the Rhine in a bruised purple light. The motel was a wreck of rotting wood and peeling paint, its neon sign buzzing like a dying insect. SWAT teams moved like shadows, positioning themselves behind the rusted cars in the lot. He's in room 14, DuPont whispered to me, his hand on my shoulder. He's armed with a hunting knife, and he's barricaded the door. We can't breach without risking the kids. The walls are too thin. He'll hear us coming. I'm going in, I said. It wasn't a request. Mr. Beaumont, that's suicide, DuPont protested. He wants me, Inspector. I'm the leverage he needs to get out of the country. If I walk up those stairs alone, he'll think he still has the upper hand. It's the only way to get him away from the door. DuPont hesitated, then nodded slowly. He signaled his men to hold their positions. They fitted me with a concealed microphone and a thin Kevlar vest under my coat. The walk across the gravel parking lot was the longest journey of my life. Every crunch of stone under my boots felt like a countdown. I climbed the exterior wooden stairs, each step groaning under my weight. When I reached the teal-colored door of room 14, I stopped. I could hear the muffled sound of a television inside, a news report about the Amber Alert. Victor, I called out, my voice steady despite the hammer of my pulse. It's Alaric. I'm alone. No police, no weapons. I just want to trade. You want the USB? I have it right here. The silence from inside was heavy, pressurized. Then the deadbolt clicked. The door opened just a few inches. Victor's face appeared in the gap. He was no longer the sleek CEO. His hair was a mess, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He looked like a cornered animal. Come in, slowly, he hissed. I stepped into the room. The smell of stale cigarettes and fear was overwhelming. Hugo and Sophie were huddled on one of the sagging beds, their faces pale with terror. Victor stood by the window, a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade gleaming in his hand. He had a laptop set up on the small table, likely trying to move what was left of his stolen funds. Close the door, Alaric, Victor commanded. I obeyed, the latch clicking shut with a finality that made my skin crawl. You think you're so smart? He sneered, circling me like a wolf. The great marine engineer. But you failed to notice the rot right under your feet. I've already moved the money. All I need is a clear path to the border, and you're going to give it to me. The money is gone, Victor, I said, positioning myself between him and the kids. The police have the server logs. They have Stefan. Your brother is talking, Victor. He's giving them everything to save his own skin. Shut up, he screamed, lunging forward. The knife arsed through the air, close enough that I felt the displacement of the stale air against my cheek. I'll kill them! I'll kill all of you! He was losing his grip on the logic he prided himself on. He turned his gaze toward the kids, his face contorted with a frantic, destructive energy. It's your fault, he muttered, stepping toward the bed. If you hadn't been so nosy. He raised the knife, his attention entirely focused on the threat I represented and the children he intended to use. He didn't see the movement on the floor. Hugo didn't scream. He didn't hesitate. With a burst of speed I didn't know a 13-year-old possessed, he launched himself from the bed. He didn't try to grab the knife. He went for the knees. He hit Victor with the force of a high-speed collision, his shoulder slamming into the back of Victor's joints. Victor's legs buckled. He let out a roar of surprise and rage. As he went down, the knife skittering across the stained carpet and disappearing under the heavy dresser. Now, I yelled. The world exploded. The door was blown off its hinges with a splintering crack that sounded like a deck beam snapping in a storm. Flashbang grenades detonated, filling the room with a blinding white light and a concussive force that rattled my teeth. SWAT officers flooded in like a black tide, their boots thundering on the floorboards. Get down, hands on the ground. I dove for the children, wrapping my arms around Hugo and Sophie as we hit the floor. I felt the heavy thud of bodies hitting the carpet, the sharp metallic click of zip ties being ratcheted tight, and the raw, guttural scream of Victor as he was pinned down. Secure, clear. Strong hands pulled me up. I was shaking, the adrenaline finally draining away to leave me cold and hollowed out. I looked down at Victor. He was pressed into the carpet, the polished veneer of his life finally stripped away to reveal the raw, ugly grain of the monster beneath. Hugo looked up at me, his eyes wide but clear. I saw the loose bolt, Grandpa, he whispered, his voice trembling but proud. I waited for him to look at the wrong side. I pulled both grandchildren into a hug that I hoped would never end. Outside, the sirens began to wail. A chorus of justice cutting through the dark woods of the highway. The cage was broken. The final stress test was over, and the foundation, though cracked, had held. They say justice is blind, but as I walked into that courthouse in Cologne, I realized she was also cold, efficient, and entirely indifferent to the fact that she was tearing the last of my family apart. The air inside was thick with the scent of floor wax and old paper, the sound of my own footsteps echoing against the high marble ceilings. I sat in the front row, my hands folded tightly, watching as the man I had once called my son-in-law was led in. Victor Volkov no longer wore his tailored suits or his arrogant CEO smile. He wore a standard orange jumpsuit that looked like a jagged structural defect against the mahogany paneling of the courtroom. Beside him sat his brother, Stefan, and the disgraced pharmacist, Hans Müller, both looking like hollow shells of the men who had plotted my liquidation. The prosecution was relentless. They presented the Predator's journal, the forged documents, and the recordings Hugo had helped me recover. The courtroom fell into a stunned, heavy silence as they played the audio from the motel, Victor's cold, gravelly voice admitting he saw my grandchildren as mere decimal points. I did what was necessary for the fund, Victor said from the stand, his jaw set in a final, defiant arrogance. You don't build a legacy by being soft. Judge Wagner didn't even blink. He leaned forward, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the room. You didn't build a legacy, Mr. Volkov. You built a cemetery. The gavel struck like a demolition ball. Viktor Volkov. Life without the possibility of parole. Stefan Volkov received 18 years for his role in the forgery and money laundering. Dr. Hans Müller was sentenced to a suspended term and stripped of his license permanently for his professional misconduct. Then came the hardest part. Elena. She stood before the judge, stripped of her designer labels and the jewelry bought with stolen money. Her voice was barely a whisper as she pleaded guilty to conspiracy and elder abuse. "I wanted the life he promised," she sobbed, her words cutting through the sterile quiet of the room. "I didn't care who I had to step on, even my own father. Because of her cooperation and the fact that she had eventually led me to the police, she received 8 years, with a possibility of parole after 5. As the guards led her away, she turned to look at me, her eyes streaming with tears. "I'm sorry, Papa," she choked out. I could only nod, unable to find the words as the silver handcuffs clicked shut, a cruel echo of the expensive watches she once coveted. In the aftermath, the court granted me full, permanent guardianship of Hugo and Sophie. It was the start of a different kind of engineering project, one that required patience, love, and a commitment to honesty that our family had lacked for far too long. 3 years later, the visiting room at the correctional facility smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. I sat at a small metal table, my hands folded, waiting for the guard to bring Elena out. Hugo and Sophie sat beside me, their faces mature beyond their years. "It's okay to be nervous," I told them quietly. "She's going to look different, but she's still your mother." When Elena walked in, the transformation was total. The designer curator was gone, replaced by a woman in a standard beige uniform with her hair pulled back and her face bare. She sat down and pressed her hands against the plexiglass barrier, her palms matching the small hands of her children. "I don't know how to apologize," she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at me. "I chose the money over you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving I understand what I lost." She told me she had been studying forensic accounting in prison, hoping to help track down predators like Victor so no one else would have to go through what I did. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the note my late wife had left for me, the one that warned us not to let Elena lose her way in the shadows. "Your mother saw the cracks before any of us did, Elena," I said softly, holding the paper to the glass. "She wanted to save you. It's time you finished the job." As we walked out into the bright November sun, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were standing on solid ground. Our final stop was the promenade along the Rhine. The air was crisp, and the water flowed with a rhythmic honesty that I had come to respect. I stood by the new reinforced steel railing, the kind with double-bolted supports that I had personally inspected. Next to the railing, I had placed a small memorial plaque. It honored Clara and Brigitte, the women Victor had treated like disposable materials before he moved on to me. They were no longer just line items on a balance sheet, they were remembered. I turned to Hugo, who was now 16 and had grown into a young man with a keen eye for detail. I handed him a heavy leather folder, the legal transfer of my marine engineering firm. "You were the one who saw the first loose bolt, Hugo," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You saved my life because you weren't afraid to look at the truth when everyone else wanted to look away. This company is yours now. Keep the foundations honest." He looked at the firm's seal, then out at the river. "I will, Grandpa. I promise." I looked out at the Cologne sunset, the sky turning a deep, royal purple. My life wasn't a finished schematic. It was a constant revision of plans until the structure could finally stand on its own. I had lost a daughter to prison and a son-in-law to the darkness, but I had gained a future built on something stronger than gold. As I look back on this journey, I realize that this was never just a fight for survival. It was a lesson about the dangerous comfort of trusting the wrong people simply because they share your last name. For years, I believed that providing a comfortable life was enough to keep a family together, but I learned the hard way that when respect and honesty disappear, the foundation is already beginning to crack. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, it is this. Never ignore the warning signs. Boundaries are not an act of hate. They are an act of protection. Sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is stand up to the rot within your own home to protect the innocent ones who cannot protect themselves. Trust your instincts. Look for the loose bolts in your relationships and never sacrifice your dignity just to keep a false peace. Thank you for walking with me through the darkest currents of my life, all the way to this new shore. Your support and your perspective mean more than you know. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the strength of the truth, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps me continue to share these meaningful insights and stories of resilience. Don't forget to comment below. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done in my shoes? Until next time, keep your foundation strong and your eyes open. Thank you for watching.